Imagine standing in the freezing mud on the western bank of the Rhine River in late March of 1945. The night air is thick, damp, and eerily quiet, save for the rushing current of the dark water in front of you. You cannot see them, but you know they are there. Across a front stretching for miles, hidden under camouflage netting and tucked behind ruined farmhouses, sit 10,000 artillery pieces. The breeches are locked, the lanyards are taut, the gun crews are holding their breath, staring at the glowing dials of their synchronized watches. When the second hand strikes the designated hour, the horizon does not just light up, it physically erupts. The concussive wave of 10,000 heavy guns firing simultaneously liquefies the earth beneath your boots and turns the night sky into a terrifying man-made dawn. This was not merely a preliminary bombardment. This was the unleashed wrath of an industrial titan, a localized apocalypse designed to obliterate the very geography of the German defensive line. Welcome to the channel, where we dissect the brutal realities of combat, the logistical miracles that sustain armies, and the strategic decisions that alter human history. If you want to understand how wars are actually fought, won, and lost on the ground, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our ranks. Today, we are tearing apart one of the most terrifying displays of concentrated firepower ever witnessed on a battlefield. We are analyzing Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine, and the firestorm that broke the back of the Third Reich. To understand why the American and British armies brought 10,000 guns to a single river crossing, we have to rewind the clock. We cannot just look at the winter of 1944, we have to look at the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, specifically targeted this exact region. The Rhineland was designated as a demilitarized buffer zone, a geographical shield meant to protect France and Belgium from future German aggression. For over a decade, it remained a quiet, unoccupied strip of land. But in 1936, Adolf Hitler gambled. He marched his newly formed Wehrmacht battalions across the bridges and back into the Rhineland. The Western powers, paralyzed by political indecision and the trauma of the trenches, did absolutely nothing. That single, catastrophic geopolitical failure guaranteed that a generation later, American boys from Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania would have to fight their way through frozen forests and shattered cities just to get back to this exact same river. The Rhine is not just a body of water. In the German cultural and military mindset, it is a psychological fortress. It is the mythological boundary of the homeland. No invading army had successfully crossed the Rhine in force since Napoleon Bonaparte. For the German High Command in early 1945, the Rhine was their final desperate hope. The disastrous Ardennes offensive, known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge, had completely bled their armored reserves dry. The Soviet steamroller was simultaneously crushing the Eastern Front, pushing inexorably toward Berlin. But if the Wehrmacht could somehow hold the Rhine in the west, if they could turn the river into an impassable slaughterhouse, they believed they could bleed the Americans and British heavily enough to force a negotiated political settlement. How do you hold a river when the enemy has complete control of the sky, an endless supply of high explosives, and mechanized infantry divisions that can move 50 miles in a day? The cold, logical answer is that you cannot. But the German military apparatus was not going to collapse without extracting a horrific toll in blood. The geography of the Rhine was their greatest asset. In the sector chosen for Operation Plunder, north of the Ruhr Industrial Valley, the river was a monster. It was nearly 400 yards wide in places. The spring snowmelt had swollen the banks, creating a treacherous current flowing at a rapid 5 knots. The water temperature was hovering just above freezing. The banks were steep, muddy, and heavily mined. It was, for all tactical purposes, a natural anti-tank ditch on a continental scale. Defending this formidable obstacle was the German Army Group H, specifically the 1st Parachute Army, commanded by General Alfred Schlemm. Schlemm was a highly capable, battle-hardened defensive tactician. He had fought in the brutal meat grinders of Russia and Italy. He knew exactly how to use terrain to multiply the effectiveness of his forces. But the army he commanded in March of 1945 was an elite force in name only. The legendary, highly trained paratroopers of 1941 were mostly buried beneath the snows of the Eastern Front or the hedgerows of Normandy. Schlemm's current ranks were a patchwork of survivors. He had Luftwaffe ground personnel who had never fired a rifle in combat. He had old men drafted into the Volkssturm. He had teenage boys pulled directly from the Hitler Youth. What they lacked in offensive capability, they made up for with fanatical desperation and entrenched heavy weapons. They had zero air support from the Luftwaffe. They had virtually no fuel for their remaining Panzerkampfwagen 4 and Panther tanks, which were instead dug into the rubble of towns like Wesel to act as static pillboxes. But what Schlemm did have was the dreaded 88mm Flak gun. Originally designed to shoot down heavy bombers, the Germans had long ago discovered that depressing the barrel to fire horizontally made it the most lethal anti-tank weapon of the war. Schlemm positioned these 88s, along with heavy machine guns and mortars, in concrete bunkers and fortified farmhouses directly overlooking the crossing sites. Any American or British landing craft attempting to traverse that 400 yards of open, rushing water would be staring directly down the barrels of weapons capable of vaporizing a Sherman tank at 2 miles. Facing this desperate defense was the Allied 21st Army Group under the overall command of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was a commander who despised chaos. He was methodical, cautious, and obsessed with logistical superiority. He completely refused to risk a hasty, improvised river crossing. He wanted a massive set-piece battle. He demanded overwhelming, crushing, indisputable superiority in men, machines, and above all, artillery. Anchoring the southern flank of Montgomery's operation was the United States Ninth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Hood Simpson. Simpson is arguably one of the most underrated and overlooked American commanders of the Second World War. Tall, completely bald, quiet, and ruthlessly efficient, Simpson was the exact opposite of the flamboyant General George S. Patton. Simpson did not carry ivory-handled revolvers, and he did not court the press. He simply executed complex operational maneuvers with flawless precision. His Ninth Army was a highly oiled machine, and for this operation they were tasked with punching across the river south of Wesel, while the British forces crossed to the north. To ensure that Simpson and his British counterparts did not send their infantry into a meat grinder, the Allied logistical network performed a miracle of modern military engineering. Let us break down the brutal mathematics of 10,000 artillery pieces. We are not talking about light infantry mortars, we are talking about the M2A1 105mm howitzer, the absolute workhorse of the United States Army. This gun was a masterpiece of mass production, capable of throwing a 33-pound high-explosive fragmentation shell over 7 miles. We are talking about the 155mm Long Tom, a massive field gun hurling a 95-pound projectile over 14 miles with pinpoint accuracy. We are also talking about the devastating 8-inch howitzers and the monstrous 240mm siege guns, weapons that fired shells so heavy they required mechanical cranes just to load the breeches. To feed this mechanical beast, the logistical train had to stretch all the way back across the Atlantic Ocean. The industrial heartland of America, the factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh were running 24 hours a day, stamping out brass casings and pouring high explosives. Millions of these artillery shells were loaded onto Liberty ships, sailed through U-boat-infested waters, unloaded at the shattered port of Antwerp, and trucked to the front lines by the relentless convoys of the Red Ball Express and its successor operations. The sheer physical weight of the ammunition stockpiled on the western bank of the Rhine in the weeks leading up to the attack was staggering. Engineers reported that the millions of tons of brass, steel, and explosives literally caused the muddy ground to sink several inches. We must compare this logistical and tactical reality to other famous river crossings in military history to truly grasp the scale. Think about General George Washington crossing the Delaware River in 1776. That was a desperate, stealthy maneuver conducted in the dead of night with a few thousand freezing men in wooden rowboats, relying entirely on the element of surprise to attack a drunken Hessian garrison. Think about Julius Caesar bridging the Rhine in 55 BC. Caesar had his Roman legions construct a massive wooden bridge in just 10 days, marched his army across to terrorize the Germanic tribes, and then burned the bridge behind him, just to prove that Rome could strike anywhere. Operation Plunder was not about stealth, and it was certainly not a psychological demonstration. It was an exercise in brute force annihilation. The Allies were not just going to row across in the dark, they were going to build multiple heavy-duty pontoon bridges, Bailey bridges, capable of supporting 30-ton Sherman tanks, and M2 treadway bridges, all while under direct enemy fire. To accomplish this engineering feat, the combat engineers needed the German defenders on the far bank to be dead, deaf, paralyzed by shell shock, or buried alive in their own bunkers. To achieve this level of destruction, the American and British artillery commanders relied on the most sophisticated fire control doctrines on the planet. The United States Army had perfected a tactic known as time on target, or TOT. In a standard artillery barrage, guns fire when ready, resulting in a steady, rolling drumbeat of explosions that gives the enemy a few precious seconds to dive into trenches or concrete bunkers. Time on target changed the fundamental physics of the battlefield. Artillery batteries located at varying distances from the target would calculate the exact flight time of their specific shells. A battery of 105mm guns 3 miles away, a battery of 155mm guns 6 miles away, and a battery of 8-inch guns 10 miles away would all fire at precisely staggered intervals. The result was a mathematical nightmare for the defenders. A light shell, a medium shell, and a heavy bunker-busting shell would all arrive from different trajectories and detonate on the exact same target at the exact same millisecond. The psychological and physical shock of a TOT barrage is indescribable. There is no warning whistle of an incoming shell. There is no time to react. 1 second, a German machine gun crew is standing at their post looking across the river, and the next second, the very atmosphere around them is instantly converted into a supersonic shockwave of jagged steel shrapnel and lethal overpressure. Now, take that level of synchronized destruction and multiply it by 10,000 individual gun barrels. The stockpiles were finally complete. The massive canvas camouflage nets were pulled back, revealing a forest of steel barrels pointing east toward the heart of Germany. The gunners stood silently by their breeches, gripping the firing lanyards, their eyes fixed on the battery commanders. The infantrymen of the 30th and 79th Divisions crouched in the freezing mud right at the water's edge, gripping their M1 Garand rifles, waiting for the sky to tear open. The darkness hovering over the rushing waters of the Rhine was about to be shattered by a firestorm unlike anything the world had ever seen. The final order crackled over the field telephones. The word was fire. The resulting sound was not a series of individual explosions, but a continuous physical tearing of the atmosphere that vibrated right through the bone marrow of every man within 20 miles. 10,000 artillery pieces recoiled simultaneously, sending a wave of steel and high explosives screaming across the dark expanse of the Rhine River. To truly understand the mechanical violence of this moment, we have to look closely at the tools of destruction. Take the 155mm M1A1 howitzer, affectionately and terrifyingly known as the Pig. It required a highly trained, physically exhausted crew of 11 men to operate. These artillerymen had to manually lift a 95-pound steel projectile, shove it into the breech, and ram it home with a heavy wooden staff. They then loaded the silk bags of smokeless powder, slammed the heavy interrupted screw breech block shut, inserted the primer, and pulled the lanyard. The gun would roar, spitting a 30-foot tongue of flame, and the massive barrel would violently slam backward into its hydro-pneumatic recoil mechanism. This complex system of oil and compressed nitrogen absorbed tens of thousands of pounds of rearward force in a fraction of a second, smoothly returning the barrel to battery so the crew could do it all over again. They were firing at a sustained rate of 2 rounds per minute. Despite the ambient temperature hovering around a miserable 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the gun crews were stripped down to their undershirts, their bodies slick with sweat, their faces blackened by cordite smoke, functioning as biological cogs in a massive industrial killing machine. How do you keep 10,000 steel barrels from melting down under that kind of sustained, rapid fire? You do not just fire blindly. You manage the heat. Artillery officers strictly monitored the rate of fire, rotating batteries and relying on the freezing night air to cool the blistering steel. If a gun crew fired too fast for too long, the barrel would overheat, the steel would expand, and the rifling would wear out, causing the shells to tumble wildly in flight, or worse, detonate prematurely inside the tube. This was a masterclass in controlled, calculated devastation. We can compare this mathematically precise bombardment to the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. In 1916, the British fired over 1.5 million shells at the German trenches over a week-long period. But the British relied heavily on shrapnel shells, which exploded in the air and showered the ground with lead balls. It was terrifying, but it failed to cut the barbed wire or crush the deep concrete dugouts. The American and British gunners on the Rhine in 1945 did not make that mistake. They used delay fuse high explosives. These heavy shells did not detonate on impact. They buried themselves several feet deep into the muddy German embankments and concrete bunker roofs before exploding. This created localized, subterranean earthquakes that ruptured the foundations of the German defenses, collapsing trenches and burying the defenders alive in their own fortifications. As the earth shook, the assault infantry prepared to move. Down at the water's edge, hidden by the darkness and the deafening roar of the guns, the men of the United States 30th Infantry Division, the legendary Old Hickory Division, crouched in the freezing mud. These were not green replacements. These were hardened killers from the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Georgia. They had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. They had survived the brutal Mortain counterattack, and they had bled in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. They knew exactly what was waiting for them on the other side. Their transport across this 400-yard-wide, fast-flowing, freezing river consisted of double-banked wooden storm boats. These were essentially large, flat-bottomed plywood skiffs powered by commercial 50-horsepower Evinrude outboard motors. It was a terrifyingly fragile vessel for a combat assault, but the Ninth Army had another trick up its sleeve. Mixed in with the wooden storm boats were 36-foot-long landing craft, the famous LCVP Higgins boats. Yes, the exact same boats that stormed the beaches of Omaha and Iwo Jima were sitting in the mud of a landlocked German forest. The United States Navy's Task Group 122.2, consisting of veteran sailors wearing Army olive drab uniforms, had trucked these massive wooden and mahogany boats on heavy flatbed trailers all the way across France and Belgium. It was an absolute logistical absurdity, but it gave the infantry a heavily armoured, high-capacity ferry to cross the treacherous current. Why would you willingly drive a plywood boat into a river choked with floating ice under the guns of an entrenched enemy while completely blinded by your own smokescreen? Because the alternative is letting the enemy see you perfectly. War is exclusively composed of terrible choices, and the Allied commanders chose concealment over visibility. To hide the crossing fleets, chemical mortar battalions deployed hundreds of 50-gallon drums of fog oil. They heated this oil to create massive, dense clouds of thick, choking white smoke that the wind carried directly across the river, blanketing the German positions. The smoke blinded the dreaded German 88mm anti-tank guns, but it also completely disoriented the American boat coxswains. They were steering blind, fighting a 5-knot current, relying on compasses and the sheer noise of the exploding artillery on the far bank to guide them. At 0200 hours on March 24, 1945, the tactical symphony shifted. The artillery commanders ordered the barrage to lift. The guns did not stop firing, but they incrementally increased their elevation. The wall of high explosives rolled off the immediate riverbank and moved several hundred yards inland, creating a protective box barrage that isolated the German frontline defenders from their reinforcements. The Evinrude motors roared to life. The storm boats pushed off the muddy banks, their propellers biting into the freezing water. The crossing of the Rhine had officially begun. Inside the boats, the infantrymen kept their heads down, gripping their M1 Garand rifles. The Garand was a masterpiece of American engineering, a semi-automatic rifle that gave the individual American infantryman an overwhelming advantage in rate of fire over his bolt-action-equipped German counterpart. But in the middle of a river, a rifle is useless. The men were entirely at the mercy of the water, the wood, and the enemy. As the boats emerged from the thick smoke screen and approached the eastern bank, the surviving German defenders opened fire. The heavy artillery had shattered many of the bunkers, but it is a grim mathematical reality of war that you cannot kill every single defender with artillery alone. General Alfred Schlemm's patchwork army of paratroopers, old men and Hitler Youth manned their surviving MG-42 machine gun nests. The MG-42 was arguably the most terrifying infantry weapon of the Second World War. Known as Hitler's buzzsaw, it fired a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute. The cyclic rate was so fast that the human ear could not distinguish individual gunshots. It just sounded like heavy canvas being ripped in half. The German machine gunners swept their fields of fire across the water, the tracer rounds glowing a sickly green in the darkness. What happens when a wooden storm boat travelling at 10 knots meets a burst of armour-piercing incendiary rounds flying at 3,000 feet per second? The wood does not just splinter, it disintegrates. The rounds punch through the plywood hull, instantly turning the boat into a sinking coffin. Men weighed down by 60 pounds of wet wool uniforms, ammunition bandoliers, and steel helmets were thrown into the freezing, fast-moving current. If the bullets did not kill them, the thermal shock and the weight of their own gear dragged them to the muddy bottom. The crossing was a chaotic, bloody scramble. Boats collided in the smoke. Outboard motors stalled, fouled by the thick mud and debris churning in the water. But the sheer volume of the American assault overwhelmed the depleted German defenders. We can look at the disastrous crossing of the Rapido River in Italy in early 1944 to see what happens when a river assault fails. At the Rapido, the American 36th Infantry Division was ordered to cross a heavily defended river with inadequate boats, poor intelligence, and insufficient artillery support. They were slaughtered, suffering over 2,000 casualties in a matter of hours, achieving absolutely nothing. General William Hood Simpson and his 9th Army staff had studied that bloody failure intimately. They knew that overwhelming firepower, specialized naval equipment, and relentless momentum were the only substitutes for American blood. They did not trickle their forces across the Rhine. They shoved them across in a massive, unstoppable wave. The first wave of the 30th Division hit the eastern bank. The ramps of the Higgins boats dropped, and the infantry surged forward into the knee-deep, freezing mud. They immediately encountered dense belts of barbed wire and anti-personnel mines. The combat engineers, moving right alongside the riflemen, deployed Bangalore torpedoes. These were long steel tubes packed with TNT, shoved under the wire and detonated to blast a clear path for the infantry. The Americans fought their way up the steep embankments, engaging in brutal close-quarters trench clearing. It was a nightmare of hand grenades, bayonets, and point-blank rifle fire. The German defenders, stunned by the concussive force of the artillery and blinded by the smoke, fought desperately, but they were systematically eradicated from their fighting holes. Within hours, the 30th Division, along with the 79th Division to their south, had carved out a fragile, bloody foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine, seizing the shattered remains of towns like Orsoy and Rheinberg. The infantry had done the impossible. They had breached the mythological barrier of the German homeland. But a few thousand riflemen holding a strip of mud cannot win a campaign. Infantry forces are highly vulnerable to mechanized counterattacks. General Schlemm knew this. He was already frantically shifting his surviving panzer reserves, scraping together every operational tank and assault gun he had left, preparing to crush the American bridgehead before it could be reinforced. The American infantry desperately needed heavy armor, anti-tank guns, and massive supply convoys to survive the coming dawn. They needed bridges. As the combat engineers rushed to the water's edge with thousands of tons of steel pontoons and heavy treadways, ready to build floating highways under direct enemy mortar fire, a low, menacing drone began to build in the western sky. The sun was just starting to rise, and the largest single-day airborne armada in human history was heavily loaded, fueled, and flying straight toward the Rhine. That low, menacing drone vibrating in the eastern sky was the sound of Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne drop in the history of warfare. Over 1,500 C-47 Skytrain transport planes and hundreds of Waco CG-4A gliders blotted out the rising sun, carrying over 16,000 heavily armed paratroopers of the United States 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division. Unlike previous airborne operations that dropped men deep behind enemy lines in the dead of night, Operation Varsity was executed in broad daylight, and the drop zones were located just a few miles inland, directly on top of the German artillery positions and reserve staging areas. The strategy was brutally simple, designed to immediately neutralize General Alfred Schlemm's ability to launch a coordinated armored counterattack against the fragile infantry bridgeheads on the riverbank. The Waco gliders, constructed of nothing more than steel tubing and canvas, were essentially flying coffins carrying jeeps, 75mm pack howitzers, and squads of infantry directly into the teeth of German anti-aircraft fire. As the gliders crash-landed into the farm fields and the paratroopers descended through a hail of tracer fire, they immediately engaged in vicious point-blank firefights with the German rear echelon troops, sowing absolute chaos and completely severing the German lines of communication. While the airborne troops strangled the German reserves from behind, the United States Army combat engineers on the riverbank were executing one of the most dangerous and complex logistical miracles of the entire war. How do you build a bridge across a 400-yard-wide, fast-flowing river while the enemy is actively trying to kill you with mortars and sniper fire? You do it with relentless, mechanized efficiency and a complete disregard for human exhaustion. The engineers deployed the M2 Treadway Bridge, a brilliant piece of military hardware consisting of massive inflatable neoprene rubber pontoons that supported heavy steel trackways. Working in 38-degree water, dodging floating ice and incoming shrapnel, the engineers used heavy motorized winches and steel cables to anchor the pontoons against the 5-knot current. We must look back at the American Civil War to understand the catastrophic risks of opposed river crossings. In December of 1862, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered his engineers to build pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River in broad daylight. Confederate sharpshooters, hidden in the buildings of Fredericksburg, systematically slaughtered the unarmed Union engineers, completely halting the Army of the Potomac and turning the operation into a bloody debacle. General William Hood Simpson of the Ninth Army had studied history, and he refused to let his engineers suffer the same fate. That is exactly why the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were sent across first in those plywood stormboats to ruthlessly clear the immediate banks and push the German mortars out of range before the first rubber pontoon ever touched the water. The tactical lesson here is the absolute necessity of combined arms synchronization. The infantry secured the bank, the airborne isolated the battlefield, the engineers built the roads, and the artillery provided the continuous, suffocating umbrella of protection. By the evening of March 24th, less than 24 hours after the initial assault, the combat engineers had completed multiple heavy-duty bridges across the Rhine. The mighty M4 Sherman tanks of the American Armored Divisions, specifically the upgraded Easy 8 models with their wider tracks and high-velocity 76mm guns, began rolling across the treadways, their engines roaring, their steel treads clanking against the metal decking. Once the armor was across, the German defense of the Rhine completely disintegrated. To understand why, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery demanded such an overwhelming, almost excessive accumulation of forces for this operation, we have to look at his previous, highly controversial failure. Just 6 months earlier, in September of 1944, Montgomery had launched Operation Market Garden, a rushed, narrow, and overly ambitious airborne assault into the Netherlands, designed to capture a bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Market Garden was a logistical nightmare, relying on a single highway that was constantly cut by German counterattacks, resulting in the tragic encirclement and destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division. Montgomery was severely criticized by American commanders for that reckless gamble, and he was determined that Operation Plunder would be the exact opposite. He substituted speed with mass, and he substituted surprise with absolute, undeniable industrial annihilation. The crossing of the Rhine was not just a tactical victory, it was the ultimate manifestation of American economic and logistical supremacy. Consider the multidimensional perspective of this single battle. Economically, the United States was fighting a war of unparalleled material expenditure. Every single 155mm artillery shell fired during that 10,000-gun barrage cost the American taxpayer roughly $40 in 1945 currency. When you multiply that by the millions of rounds stockpiled, you are looking at the gross domestic product of a small nation being vaporized in a single night. The factories in Detroit and Chicago were not just outproducing the ruined German industrial base, they were completely redefining the scale of human conflict, proving that a fully mobilized capitalist democracy could overwhelm a fascist dictatorship through sheer manufacturing tonnage. Logistically, the supply lines stretching from the ports of Antwerp all the way to the Rhine were a marvel of modern management. The military pipeline system, known as Pluto, was pumping millions of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel and diesel directly from the English Channel to the front lines, ensuring that the Sherman tanks and fighter bombers never ran dry. From an intelligence standpoint, the Allied commanders had a terrifyingly clear picture of the German defences. The ultra-secret codebreakers at Bletchley Park were intercepting and decoding the Enigma transmissions of the German High Command, allowing General Simpson to know exactly how few tanks General Schlemm actually had in reserve. Combined with relentless aerial photography from P-38 Lightning reconnaissance planes, the American artillery commanders had the exact grid coordinates of almost every German Flak battery before the first shot was even fired. Politically, the rapid crossing of the Rhine sent a massive shockwave all the way to Moscow. The Yalta Conference had recently concluded, and the geopolitical map of post-war Europe was being carved up. Joseph Stalin's Red Army was already within 50 miles of Berlin, and the Soviet dictator firmly believed that the Western Allies were bogged down and incapable of matching Soviet momentum. By shattering the Rhine defences and rapidly encircling the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany, the American and British armies proved they could project massive power deep into Central Europe, securing vital leverage for the coming Cold War. The template established here on the banks of the Rhine, the doctrine of overwhelming logistical preparation, absolute air supremacy, and devastating preliminary bombardment, became the permanent blueprint for the American way of war. We saw this exact same doctrine deployed half a century later during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Before the coalition ground forces ever crossed the border into Iraq, the United States military spent months building up an unstoppable logistical mountain in the Saudi desert, followed by weeks of relentless precision aerial bombardment that completely paralyzed the Iraqi command structure. When the ground war finally launched, the famous left hook maneuver crushed the Iraqi army in just 100 hours, mirroring the rapid mechanized exploitation that followed the crossing of the Rhine. The German Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, was quickly trapped in the massive Ruhr pocket, leading to the surrender of over 300,000 German soldiers and effectively ending the war in the West. The Rhine River, the mythological barrier that had protected the German homeland for centuries, had been violently breached, not by tactical finesse, but by the raw, unadulterated application of industrial firepower. War is rarely decided by the romantic heroism of individuals alone. It is decided by the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of logistics, the steady output of factories thousands of miles away, and the terrifying synchronization of steel, high explosives, and human endurance. Now, I want to hear your strategic assessment in the comments below. Which factor do you believe was the most critical to the success of the massive Rhine crossing? A. The overwhelming 10,000-gun artillery barrage that shattered the German front-line defences. B. The massive airborne drop of Operation Varsity that disrupted the German armoured reserves. C. The logistical miracle of the combat engineers building heavy pontoon bridges under direct enemy fire. Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments, and I will see you on the next battlefield.